have Jim introduce our program for this evening. Jim Cox, our Vice President. Give him a round of applause.
I am delighted this evening to reintroduce my neighbors, Bob and Lucy Duncan. They were here several months ago talking about birding in Gulf Breeze. And tonight they're going to talk about their earliest memories of the history of Gulf Breeze. And that's significant because when you look at the peninsula of Gulf Breeze, okay, in 1870, there was not a single settler on the entire peninsula. And then in the early 1870s, the western portion of the peninsula was settled by James and Nelson Duncan. And Bob is a direct descendant from them, okay? And it's preserved the Duncan name on the western part of our island for all these years, okay? I'm lucky enough to live right next to the Duncan Cemetery. It's a private cemetery right across the street from the First Baptist Church on Fairpoint Drive, okay? And the earliest gravestone in that cemetery is 1876.
Wow.
So that's almost 150 years old. You know, that's pretty phenomenal, okay? But that's, I'm sure you'll touch on that, okay? But I'm lucky enough to live right next door to them, okay? So I'm delighted to introduce, once again, Bob and Lucy Duncan. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us. Yes, before I get into that, I want to digress. I read that the things they carried up there, it says there were 2 British ships in the cove. There's another ship in the cove, and it was the Capa da Roca, a Portuguese ship. And it was in Pensacola, it was abandoned, and it was starting to leak, and they were afraid it would block the harbor. So they decided they would take it over here and scuttle it. They scuttled it in the cove, and when I was a kid, the mast was still sticking up. I would tie it to the mast and fish and catch, of all things, snapper, sea bass, black sea bass. So I want to tell you all about that. So you can sort of get with these folks and if they have to know that information. Come on up here, dear.
Okay. Safety in numbers.
Okay. Who were the Duncans? Well, they came from Kentucky. They had a plantation near Louisville, and after the Civil War, which they want to lose inside, they came down here. James Duncan came first. He was my great uncle, and he got a land grant from the government. Now, can you imagine in the late 19th century there was still land available to homestead? Yeah. Why didn't anybody want to walk these? Well, there was no bridge, and what was the land worth? You couldn't grow anything except weeds and this sand, and there was no timber to harvest. So they got this land grant, and all you had to do was live on it under the old Homestead Act, live on it for 5 years, I think, and put a fence around it. And so they got the first grant was from about where the Baptist church is on Fairpoint all the way to the very tip of the peninsula. And then the second grant was from what's called Hoffman Bayou. The Duncan people called it the Lake House. That was the Lake House, and it went all the way to Live Oak, but all on the north side of 98. They didn't want the land in between, it was worthless. That's where some of you folks live. And believe me, you would not recognize it if you saw pictures of it. It was basically flat, sandy, bare spots, scrub, and they were intermittent little ponds. After it rained, it would last a long time. So when you have flooding areas, flooding problems in that area, you understand why. Because the rain drains down from Shoreline Park. So,
What we want to do, we want to show you some of the early photographs, and then Bob will get on into a little bit of later history here. So I'm going to move forward while he talks with some of the older photographs that some of you have probably seen elsewhere. But anyway, so James Duncan, who was Bob's great-great-uncle, and with Zebedee, I don't know what kind of dog that was, other than the fact that probably in the summertime, a very warm dog.
Right.
James Duncan, he got the original land grant. He was a bachelor. And they had this land, and after the war, that's the Civil War, he invited his brother, Nelson, my great-great-grandfather, and Nelson's family to come down here and settle. So that's the beginning of the Duncan homestead.
Speaking of the homestead, there's one of the two photographs we have of it. That homestead was very close to where Judy Simon lives. It was a little bit.
Judy Simons is here tonight.
Yeah, just a little bit to the west of where she is now, I think. And it was a great big old two-story house, and there were a bunch of kids in the family, so they got a bunch of places for the kids. And lots of portraits that they could stay cool on. There's another view of it. And of course, here's the walkway that goes down to the bay. This is looking at it from the bay side. So, Judy, that's where you, just about where you are. Yeah.
And I've got a picture that Ms. Adams gave me of showing the house as a two-story.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the land grant. So the Duncans came here, and as of about 1880, there were only 3 houses in Town Point, this is what Galbraith was called. The Duncans lived over here for 50 years before the first bridge was built and before the Benson Post Office. The first house was, actually the first house was the Lake House where Hoffman Bayou is, where the Hampton is now. That was called the Lake House, which was freshwater at the time, and the Duncans tried to raise goats, and all the alligators would get the goats.
Oh.
Anyway,
Tell them about the big cast iron pot that was thrown in the lake.
oh, that was not in the script, but
I didn't think that
okay.
until now.
This was in the middle, what we call the middle lake, which is called what, Woodlawn Bayou? Is that it? Had 3 lakes.
Yeah.
I think it's in Woodlawn Bayou. One of my relatives, way back probably in the 20s or 30s, went around with a metal detector and found, they got a reading and started digging, and they came up with a cast iron pot about that big, which was octagonal, and they didn't know what to do with it. So back then we used to harvest oysters out of the bayous, believe it or not, and he just threw it back in the bayou to collect oysters. So somewhere in that bayou, what we call the middle, there's a cast iron pot that would have some history in it, but God knows where. Anyway.
I'm going to interrupt since I just put that up there. Summertime.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, dear Lord, have mercy.
Okay, there were 3 houses in 1880. They were the only houses until the first bridge was built. The second house was where Judy lives on the point, and what's now Peaks Point, and that was the other house. And the third house was about halfway between, about just north of the Baptist church, where the Baptist church is today, which is probably on what is now Turner or Cole property. And it was occupied by my father's uncle Dallas. I guess it's my great uncle. And he lost his wife very early, had this little boy to raise, and it was Finley Duncan. And he was a sturgeon fisherman. And sturgeon were quite plentiful in the bay back in those days. So that was Uncle Dallas, and at the first meeting I came to tell you all about was about the mystery ship and the coffin that was found just
Yeah.
to the north of that house, but I'm not gonna go into that now because you all have heard that story. Right? Okay.
Yep, that
You
was-
didn't hear it probably. You didn't hear it. Okay, I'll tell you sometime in private.
It,
Okay.
it might be, I might have him, is it recorded, his previous one? Well, the birding one is, but I don't think their first
Yeah.
one is, but you
The
go
co-
check.
The coffin is now in the Wentworth Museum.
T.T.
Tell
Wentworth,
us
right.
about it. Yeah, tell us about it.
Oh, you all, okay.
Yeah.
You heard it already.
Tell the story.
Okay.
She did, he never heard it? Oh, goodness.
All right, the year's about 1915, and my father was a little boy, and there were only 3 houses, and Uncle Dallas, the middle house, he had a little boy. My folks sent my father to spend the night with him so they could play, and the house was an old frame house, and Lucy's going to show you the house. And anyway, night comes. What do you do back in those days? No television or anything, no electricity. So you got this house set back in the woods, and nobody can see it from anywhere else. You can't see it from the bay. It's dark, and they're waiting to go to bed, and on their screen porch, and there's a ship comes sailing in, and it starts coming in towards along the edge of the reef in deep water, and anchors are right out in front of the house. And this is very unusual because ships never came in that direction and anchored out there. So my Uncle Dallas with 2 little boys wondered what's going on. So he said, we'll just stay here and see what we're going to be up to. And so he watches, and the men put a boat down, a ship, and get out of the boat with lanterns, and they start rowing towards the house. So Uncle Dallas is really starting to get concerned. But they came in about 100 yards away from the house, from what my father says, because my father remembered this. And they started digging. And, well, ultimately they got back in the boat with the lanterns and went back to the ship and sailed off. Now the ship was I think they said a 3 or 4 masted vessel, was probably under steam because they were coming back in those days. They would come out under steam, and I don't think it would have sailed in there. Anyway, next morning my Uncle Dallas said, "Well, let's go see what they were doing." And so he goes on down there with a shovel, and he finds out where they were digging, and he starts digging, and bang, he hits something metal. So he starts digging, and there's a coffin. And it's a metal coffin, it's a lead coffin. He opens it up, and there in the coffin is a red-haired skeleton in an old-fashioned naval uniform. Now this was told to me many times by my father, and I thought, well, it's a story. That's a story he's telling, because in those days they made up stories.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
TV.
I'm going to interrupt. Ultimately, the coffin was dug up by someone from Pensacola. It was taken into Pensacola and sat on the end of the Palafox Wharf for a period of time, and then T.T. Wentworth took it and put it in his collection, which became the T.T. Wentworth Museum, which is now owned by the university. And so,
well, yeah, I wanted to confirm the story, so about 20 years ago I decided I was downtown. I'll go in the museum and take a look and see if there's any truth to this. I'm walking there, sure enough, there's the coffin. So ultimately, I found out from an archaeologist, somebody who was involved in the research, found out it was a vintage French 1760 naval officer's uniform. So the big question was, who were they? Did they put it there, or did they dig it up? Another archaeologist told me there was a French naval hospital in the vicinity of where the coffin was put. So, in the last, 10 or 15 years, I took Lucy to the museum, and you can take it from there.
well, we went down there, and before we went, Bob wrote this story up, and we took it down to one of the curators, and he said, well, let me go show you the coffin. So they had it up on a high shelf way in the back, and we saw it, and I said, can I climb up there and look at it? Yeah, I climbed up there and looked at it, had these really neat handles on the side, you can carry a heavy coffin, you need a good substantial thing. But they had no idea where it came from, they knew nothing about the provenance of it. So Bob gave them, then gave them a copy of what he had written, and they were just, needless to say, very grateful to have some information on it.
Yes.
So-
You know, where it came from and
So there were only 3 houses in the mountain until the first bridge was built. But,
this was
my,
Bob's grandfather up there.
that's my grandfather. You've got a picture of Nelson.
We've already done that.
Nelson, okay. Nelson, my great-grandfather, wound up in a prison in Delaware. And his jailer was a guy named Frank McKay.
By the way, he was a
It was-
prisoner because he was on the wrong side of the Civil War and was captured by the Yankees.
He was captured in the Civil War. He was a Confederate soldier. And he was captured and put in this prison. And he
Look at those
became,
boots he's got on. Aren't they cool boots?
He
And
became-
that hat and stuff almost looks like a.
he and McKay became good
soldier.
friends. And when the Duncans got all this land, they invited Frank McKay to come on down and leave Ohio in all that cold weather, and they would give him some land. And you know where that land was?
Town Point?
You know where Becky lives?
Yeah.
Just inside the gate of Peaks Point. The old house was actually, part of it was standing
It was
when
still there
we
when Bob and I
married.
got married in '66, so we're coming up on 58 years. My grandmother said we'd never work. It might not. Anyway, the remains of that house was still there, and McKay had planted plum trees and peach trees and stuff like that, and those were still there at the time. And we used to go with my boys, and we'd go up there and we'd pick these fruits.
So Frank McKay built the houses. And my grandfather was Addison Duncan McKay. George Addison Duncan. He was my grandfather. And he died in 1926. He was the captain of the Santa Rosa, which was a vessel that was charting the new intercoastal waterway to Carabel. He died in Apalachicola at the Gibson Hotel. And the last time I was here, I told you all about the ghost story. Anyway, he died in 1926 of pneumonia, and leaving my grandmother with all this land, no bridge, no Social Security. So what did she do? She sold the land, little by little. And so she sent my father to New Orleans to go to school where her sister was living. And my father met my mother, and he loved New Orleans, and that's where I was born. I lived for 19 years. So the 19 years of my life, then I went in the Army for a while. And so my earliest memories go back to about when I was 4 or 5 years old, and we would come over here from New Orleans on vacation. My father built a cabin on the land I live on right now, which had a hand pump, an outhouse, and no electricity. We'd come over here, and at that point, believe it or not, what's called Fairpoint Drive was Town Point Road, which was sand. So we would come over from New Orleans not knowing whether or not we could get down to our cabin, but my grandmother had a house where the Bank of America is right now, and he would borrow a shovel. And one of the best news we ever got in a letter, remember letters? From here was my grandmother telling my father that the road was going to be clayed. That was a big deal.
Yeah.
Anyway, I remember coming over here.
This is a picture of Bob's grandmother on the right,
Grandmother.
and his,
That's my great aunt who lived where you live until the 1960.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, 1960. And
before we go for this, and these are not in the same order as he's talking because we just had baby. But anyway, look at the vegetation, look at the changes.
yeah, look at that.
That's the side of the road at Fairpoint. So what would it cause the change?
because of the whole ecology of the area has changed.
Yeah.
And that's
You've got
why.
no fires nowadays, and you've got lots and lots of sprinklers. And people doing lawns and everything, trees have grown, it's become a different, totally different type of vegetation than there was back then. In fact, when Bob and I married, the vegetation near us on the point, we don't live on the tip of the point, we're just inside of it. Vegetation across the street from us, for example, which would be just to the west of the Baptist church, it was scrub, it was turkey oaks, you know, turkey oaks with little pointed leaves, about that big, the leaves, not the trees. And turkey oaks and Florida rosemary, yopine, there was, what's the common name for the, false foxglove, I can only remember the scientific name, false foxglove was there, and so forth. So it was all fairly low vegetation along there where Wallace lives and the people that live along there, and the trees that are there have really grown up a lot, and of course the native vegetation, the native plants that the birds fed on.
Yep.
They are, you know, they don't have the same thing because the birds don't feed on all of this imported tropical vegetation that everybody seems to like St. Augustine, etc. Okay, sorry.
So my earliest memories go back to the late 30s when Fairpoint Drive was a sand road, Town Point Road. And I remember the war years. Let's talk about World War II. What was it like here back then? I was 7 years old at the time at World War II. I want to make sure you're World War II, not World War I. Don't get me wrong, I'm not that old. Anyway, trip from New Orleans was all on old Highway 90. We would get to Pensacola, which was blacked out. You had to get on the bridge with your headlights taped and come across the bridge because of submarine threat out in the Gulf. The silhouettes of the ships could be seen. We would go across that bridge and not see another single car. Can you believe that? Anyway, we'd get down to our cabin down there, and finally, if we could dig out, and the cabin, as I say, had a hand pump and an outhouse, no electricity, and that was before the stock laws were passed. And the stock laws, the cattle in the hogs were going wild. The Bronson family, way down the highway, had these cattle. They wander all over. You could go down 198 at night, you never know whether you're going to have a cow or not. But we come over to the cabin, and the ladies had to go to the outhouse at night. They would have to wake up my father, which was very irritable, needless to say, because they were afraid of the wild hogs that might be under the house and come out and cause a ruckus. But my mother, the crabs were so plentiful in those days that my mother would say, go down, take the scoop net, go down on the beach. We had a beach back then, not rocks, and scoop up some crabs for supper. That's the way it was.
Did I show you the picture of the little wide beach? It's back there. That's what the beach looked like back then. And of course now, because of erosion, it's all bulkheaded. And then there's riprap, which is just big old granite rocks that looks like the Dickens, all along there. And so you can't, there's no beach to get down on, you know, and which is truly sad, you know. But it's not just the fact that we humans are deprived of getting on the beach if you're on this side of the bay, on this side of the peninsula, but a lot of the erosion that has occurred, part of what has happened is that we've lost a huge amount of grass beds, particularly on the north side, not quite as much loss on the south side of the peninsula. And of course, what does that mean? That affects fishing. This is where the fry, the small fish feed and breed. You know, they breed up the bay, but they grow their young down in the grass beds. You don't have that anymore. We used to go over on the south side and go out and pick up scallops. We'd want scallops for dinner. We'd go out and pick up a couple of dozen scallops, just waiting alone, feeling the scallops, you know. In fact, Bob's mother used to get irritated with me.
Their days are over.
Because I would go out and I'd get soft-shell crabs, and she had planned to go out and get them, and I had already scooped up the ones in front of the house. So I would fry soft-shell crabs for everybody. Anyway, but the day has changed. That has changed considerably.
Yeah. So we come over from New Orleans on a vacation and have fun. My mother, my father, my aunt, and my grandmother and grandfather from New Orleans. And my father liked to fish a lot, but you just couldn't say, let's go out and fish. Why? Sure.
Oh.
That's why. The entire bay was a landing strip. You Navy folks would appreciate that. These were the planes that were coming all over the bay, landing and taking off, and it was quite dangerous. So we'd have to wait till things calmed down before we could go out and fish. That's the way it was. Another slide.
Yeah, it just made me. If you notice this little plane, I said to Bob, I cannot believe they had a plane and they were practicing it in World War II, you know? But yes, they were, because they had to learn how to land on the water and so forth. But you'll notice they've got pontoons on the end of the bottom wing, and then in the very middle, that's not two pontoons, it's just one boat-like hull, like in the middle. And the this N3N dash 3 was actually the one with the pontoons that would land on the bay. Excuse me. And the ones that did not land on the bay, that were, you know, they would practice landing inland, did not have the pontoons, and that was just the N3N. And they were in production between the 30s and the early 40s, but the Navy used them up through 45 as trainers. And then, Bob.
Oh, yeah, PBYs. You Navy folks know all about PBYs, I'm sure. They were patrol planes, basically, and they would be taking off too. Not as many as the yellow ones, but it was a challenge to go fishing sometime. And
Could I speak to this plane? I looked at that thing and I thought, okay, so the fuselage is shaped like a boat. How come those wings don't get knocked over by waves and tip in the water? Well, I found out when I did a little bit of research. There you go. They had little pontoons that folded down that would give the wing floats. And to me, that's interesting. I don't know anything about airplanes, but I thought that was interesting. And then once they're airborne, those things would crank up so that they wouldn't have air resistance, and the little pontoon would be the very tip end of the wing. So I thought that was pretty clever, these guys to figure that out. Yeah.
so those are my memories of what's now Gulf Breeze and Town Point back in those days. A word about Shoreline Drive. Shoreline Drive, some of you may know, is an old place to see Blue Line laid down, estimates from 5,000 to 35,000 years ago. And believe it or not, it was an old cattle trail. The cattle that were loose had trails through the woods all around here. And then one went all the way to the point, and then the other one followed what is now Shoreline Drive, but followed the cattle trail pretty well, all the way in through Live Oak and beyond that. And anyway, it was Shoreline was created about 1953, I think. And prior to that, it was, well, there was no road at all. So, any questions?
Could I? Go ahead. I was going to say the first Pensacola Bay Bridge opened in June of '31, and it was following that Bob's father's sister. Okay, first of all, Bob's grandmother, when she sold off the land, she kept one piece of property for each of her 5 children, and then sold off the other stuff. And Bob's father's sister had one piece of property, which is now our driveway and our cottage, and then Bob's father had the piece that we have moved up to the point where Judy lives. And anyway, so Bob's father's sister built cottages on the property where she lived, which was our driveway and that cottage property of ours. And there were, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cottages there that were rental units called Duncan's Beach Cottages. And then Bob's father, when they built the house that we live in now, they built it in 55, 56. They also had another cottage up on the beach between our house and the bayfront.
That was the original cabin that was built back in the 30s.
Yeah, and so, those were built, Bob's father told me in 35, but Bob thinks that might be a little bit early for when they were built. But I don't know exactly, but late 30s we can say. This is all that's left. The original Duncan's Beach cottages. If you come in our driveway, this is on your left, and it's actually a composite of 2 of the different cottages, all shiplap work. There were 2 cottages that were pulled together, kind of like so, but they were joined with a section in between, and that's where the bathroom and a little hallway is and entrance. So
I don't know whether it predates the Benson house or not. It's gonna be close. I really don't know that. But it couldn't have, yes, sir.
That would predate it, because the Benson house was a World War II surplus building. So that was probably, we think that was more 40s, probably.
Yeah, one have questions. One more thing I want to point out.
Where is that?
Family cemetery.
On their property.
Okay.
Is dedicated as a wildlife sanctuary as well as a bird sanctuary. That's why you have a lot of brushing and all. But we just had a new gate installed, and sometime or another, when the weather cools off, we'll have a tour for you folks into the cemetery.
Yes, yes.
Yes, sir.
When was the Naval Live Oak Reservation established, and was that from your family?
That was a long time ago, long before my people. That was right after the Revolution, I think, because they needed this oak for the ships, this tough oak.
About 1817, I think.
Okay.
Before the bridge was built, how did your ancestors get here? What kind of vessel did they?
Sail.
they had a little boat that somewhere in the family pile of pictures, there's a picture of this little boat called the Trilby. It had a little awning over it so they wouldn't get too much sun on them. And it would come and go from Pensacola with their supplies. And Bob's father and Bob had told me that the reason the Duncans settled on the north side of the peninsula was because the women were lonely and they wanted to see the lights in Pensacola, but also it was a logical thing because if you had to get your supplies from town, you didn't have to go all the way around the point, you know. So
The disadvantage is we get that north wind in the wintertime, we don't get the sea breeze. Anyway, my grandfather did have a house in Pensacola on Donaldson Street because he was the captain of Santa Rosa, and I told you all about that. And so they did have a house in Pensacola and didn't live here all the time. Well, many of the Duncans did live here permanently, but I know my grandfather had a house in town because he worked. Yes, ma'am.
Well, did your family then sell the point to the Peak family? How did that come about?
The Peaks got it in 1910.
Oh, okay.
1910, what I've been told. And there's a story there that maybe the Duncan clan did not want to disclose. I was told by somebody who knew the Peaks that my great-grandfather lost the point at a card game.
Oh, no.
but we don't know if that's
They
true.
never tell me that. They're too embarrassed. If that's true.
Now, is that the Peak side of the story or the Duncan side of the story? That's probably the Peak side of the story.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay.
Well, I have something that I want to say here about changes, so let me put this right here. You can read this while I read it to you, since I know you can't read, I'll read it to you. We talked about a lot of the changes that Gulf Breeze has had, and you've seen them even if you've only been here a few years. It's changed over the years from a lightly populated shoreline along the bay to a small bustling city, small thank goodness. Highway 98 has become a busy thoroughfare with traffic issues thanks to population growth. Homes are sprouting up like sand spurs on clear-cut areas all along the peninsula. You know what I'm talking about?
Yes, ma'am.
When I say clear-cut. Each home is demanding clean water. Each home is demanding utility services while they and we consume more and more fossil fuels that heat our world. The greatest challenges and changes are yet to come over the next few decades. Look around and I see a lot of gray hair in here. I see it in the mirror. It's not just us, it's going to be our children and our grandchildren and so forth that are going to have to deal with this in critical ways. Climate change is happening. Storms are stronger, bay tides and average temperatures are going to rise. Living on the bay, we already see some of that rising. It's not all gloom and doom though. Scientists and environmentalists have provided sound solutions to many of the issues that we and our governments need to consider and to adopt. We need to encourage our elected officials to be proactive about this. And I think it's really important because some of these changes that are coming are not going to be real pleasant for those that come after us. And the thing about it is that I have absolute conclusive proof that global warming is occurring. And I can show it to you
My sentiments exactly.
That's the way it was.
Lucy, thank you.
And you know, I did not get one picture, one still shot. Did anybody get one?
Can you take a good picture, please?
And I have some cookies for you.
Just look up and then,
Turn them down.
Okay.
well, I'll probably
This is our
turn it off
traditional
first and then.
gift for the speakers. Homemade ginger crinkle cookies.
Thank you, Barbara.
Cookies over there for the audience, so.
Hi guys, haven't seen you tonight. Got a picture of the cookies. Put the people behind you, I'll duck in behind you. You got two pictures, that's incredible.
Yeah, take a few so we can put one in the,
You got a new phone.
thank you, brother.
Thank you.
Oh yeah.
That's my brother, everybody.
I got Scott's new book, I got through the forward and so many reasons.
Thank you, Nate.